From the chalk of the Sussex Downs to the chalk of the Somme battlefields, the men of Lowther's Lambs, the Southdowns Battalions of the Royal Sussex Regiment, had a long war. Who were these Sussex worthies, and what was their journey across the Western Front? Since I recorded the last podcast, some sad news has come from the Somme battlefields via my daughter, Poppy. Christiane Foucault, who lived at Pozières, has passed away at the age of 91. I first met Christiane and her husband Yves on my first visit to the Somme in 1982, when I travelled across with my dad, having just been to eat with the school. I got hold of Rose Coombs Before Endeavours Fade and John Giles, The Somme Then and Now, and we headed over to the Somme via the cross-channel ferry from Newhaven to Dieppe, and then the train down to Amiens and Albert. And that's, as I've mentioned in a previous podcast, how I got my first view of the Somme, particularly the Basilica with the Golden Virgin on the top, no longer leaning, of course, in the 1980s. But coming into the battlefields that way, it was quite a special, magical experience almost to see it like that. And we based ourselves in Albert at the Hotel de la Basilique, directly opposite the Basilica. And we just walked everywhere. We had no car, so we had no choice but to walk. But it really gave me, on that very first trip, this incredible insight into the landscape of the Somme, which has stayed with me ever since. And on one of the days, we walked from Albert up to Bapaume Post Cemetery, out to La Boisselle, to the Lochnagar mine crater, and then up to Pozières. And at Pozières British Cemetery, the gardener came out and said hello. I didn't know who he was at that stage, but that was Yves, and said a few words, and then we continued on our walk into the village. And as we came onto the route to Thiepval, the road that leads up to Thiepval, we saw a garden on the right-hand side that was full of shells. Now, not live shells. These were the cases of largely 18-pounder shrapnel shells. And when they explode in the air, it's like a shotgun cartridge, and all the shrapnel balls come flying out, and you're left with this discarded canister that comes tumbling down. And there was an entire wall of these in the garden, so we stopped to look at them, and this elderly French lady came out and started talking to us. Now, I spoke French even then, and so we struck up a conversation, and that was Christiane. And she explained that her husband was a gardener in the nearby cemetery, and we realised that we'd just met him. And that was the beginning of a lifelong friendship with them both. I came back subsequently and met them both properly. Yves had a fantastic private museum in the house of things that he picked up on the battlefields over many, many years. He was a Commonwealth War Graves Commission gardener. He joined them in 1947 when he came out of the army. And he'd met Christiane and they'd married. She'd been born in northern France. She lived in the outskirts of Armentières, and right up on the border, in fact, where she often used to say that she could lean out of her bedroom window and her arm would be in Belgium. It was that close to the border. And they'd married and moved to Pozières, where Yves came from. His father had come back from the Great War and settled in the village. And they lived in an old barrack hut for many, many years, one of the provisional houses in the village. And when I first met them in 1982, and I didn't know this at the time, they'd only just moved to the cottage in the route to Thiepval from that barrack hut, which they kept. And Yves used to have his kitchen garden there where he'd grow all his vegetables and so on. So I got to know them, and every time I went to the Somme, we'd always pop in there. And I was one of many thousands of people that both Yves and Christiane welcomed to their house over many, many years. Many of you listening to this may well have been to see them during that period. Yves continued to work for the Commission from 1947, like I say, when he first joined. His first job was at the London Cemetery at High Wood, where many of the headstones had not been put in place. It was still wooden crosses, and he worked on that, and he buried the dead from the Second World War at the back of the cemetery. They'd been brought in from the wider Somme area from the fighting in both 1940 and 1944. He continued to work in many different cemeteries, latterly at Pozières, and he retired from the commission in around about 1991-92, so a very, very long period of working for them as a gardener. When I first moved across to the Somme, naturally they were among the first people that we went to go and see, and they were incredibly helpful to myself and my family. And really, we couldn't have survived, I don't think, those first few years without Eve and Christiane helping us along, bringing vegetables over, helping with wood, helping me to fix the 2CV and learning about the mechanics of that. Just incredible people. But Eve, I often used to go out with him and he'd take me to locations and give me his knowledge of the Somme, something again that has stayed with me ever since. Sadly, Eve died suddenly in 1997, but Christiane continued to live in the house and continued to welcome visitors not just from Britain and the wider Commonwealth, but from all over the world. And she became one of those really essential figures of the Somme, part of what I'd like to describe as the old Somme, the battlefields as they were in that early years when I used to come across, barely changed since the 1920s, since the period of rebuilding, and people like them were really welcoming and accommodating and generous in the way they shared their knowledge and contacts. And there were many collectors like Eve across the Somme battlefields at that time that had these incredible private collections of artifacts picked up off the battlefield. And it was just a real education to have the opportunity to go and see collections like that. You learnt so much by handling those objects and discovering the story of where they'd come from. That generation of Somme families is sadly passing now, and almost past in many ways, and Christiane is certainly an indication of that. She could never be replaced for those of us who knew her and loved her and cared for her, but I think as well it's a part of the Somme's history that has gone with her in many, many respects. She represents the generation that saw the aftermath of one world war and then lived through another with the occupation of France during the Second World War, but never stopped caring for what was on their landscape, the cemeteries, the memorials, and the families and the visitors that came. And during their time, of course, they went from welcoming people who were directly connected to the casualties buried in the cemeteries that Eve worked in. Eve used to talk about how parents then, in that post-Second World War period, would come to visit their sons' graves. They went from that to now great-grandchildren coming across to visit the sites where a family member had fought and perhaps died. So it's indicative really of how the battlefields have changed, and we were blessed knowing people like that and learning so much from them. And it's that I think of as I record not just this episode of The Old Front Line, but many of them, and those of you who have listened from the very beginning will have heard me mention them both on and off in different episodes, and I'm sure that will continue. Next time you're on the Somme, if you take the road through Pozières up to Thiapval, just as you come out of the village on the left-hand side is the village cemetery of Pozières. It's only a small one, and Eve and Christiane now lay at rest there together with their son Pierre, who sadly died tragically, a young man, aged only 16. And if you have a spare 5 minutes, pop in there and go and visit their grave and stand a while and think about Eve walking across these fields and the years, the decades that he spent tending the graves in the many cemeteries of the Somme battlefields. Two great stalwarts of the Somme, two kind and generous people that show, despite barriers, despite language, in the end, the humanity is what links us, and that humanity is expressed through our experience in meeting people in places like this across these battlefields of the Western Front and indeed beyond. So now we'll strap on our boots and pick up our pack, and we're going to head off and look at a slightly different tale of Sussex to the Somme. If you listen to this podcast regularly, you'll know that I was born and grew up in Sussex. It's a county that remains very, very important to me, and I feel a great connection to, a chalk landscape, not dissimilar to the Somme, and I guess probably that's how my understanding of the Somme and my connection in those early years on the Somme was easy, really, in the shadow of a youth spent walking chalk downland along the Southdowns. When I came back from my first few battlefield trips, first from Ypres and then that trip to the Somme that I've mentioned in the introduction this week when I met the Foucards, that really inspired me to find out about my own locality's connection to the Great War. So where I lived, Crawley, and the wider county of Sussex and the role that it played in the Great War. And I used to go off and visit villages and places across the county where there were war memorials, do research in the archives down in Brighton or in the West Sussex Records Office in Chichester. And one of the things that I discovered as I began to look, particularly in some of the cemeteries and the churchyards in Sussex, was the reoccurrence of a particular date when it came to the commemoration of the dead from the Royal Sussex Regiment. And that date was the 30th of June 1916. Now, what had happened on that date? It was the battle, as I discovered, of the Boar's Head, the day Sussex died. We've had an earlier podcast of that, and you can go back through the podcast catalogue to find that. But what it did do, it gave me this interest in the Southdowns Battalions. Who were they? How did they come to be formed? And about the time that I became a student at the University of Chichester in the mid-1980s, I began to ramp that research up a little bit by delving more into the archives, but also going out to track down surviving veterans and visiting the sites connected to these three Southdowns battalions. So in this episode, we're going to look at a bit of their history from Sussex, where they were formed, to the Somme, which really saw the end of the original battalions that had been formed in 1914. Now, following the outbreak of war in August 1914, the regular army went to war, the territorials were mobilised, but Lord Kitchener, who was Secretary of State for War, realised that if this went on to become a long and protracted conflict, then these forces would quickly dwindle away on the battlefield, and he was right in many respects. So he called for the raising of what he named the New Army, and which the newspapers quickly called Kitchener's Army in his honour. And in Sussex, the 7th Battalion, the Royal Sussex Regiment, was formed, one of the very first battalions of Kitchener's Army, not just in Sussex, but in Great Britain, at Chichester Barracks, and within a day it was entirely full. 1,100 officers and men had been recruited. An 8th Battalion followed, a 9th Battalion followed, but all of these battalions were largely either recruited from East Sussex or West Sussex. There was no one particular battalion or group of battalions that represented the whole county. Now, in other parts of Britain, that was taking place with the formation of Chums or Pals Battalions. And although the Southdowns were never called a Pals Battalion, that is essentially what they were. So in September 1914, Claude Lowther MP, originally from Westmoreland and Cumberland, but who lived in Hurstmonceux Castle, put an advert in the Sussex press, and it read as follows: "Men of Sussex, you will not be separated. Together you will train. Together you will fight. Together you will die if needs be. But together, pray God, you may return." Now that advertisement heralded the formation of the 11th Battalion, the Royal Sussex Regiment, the 1st Southdowns Battalion, recruited right across Sussex, not just in one locality. Lowther knew everybody, and he used his contacts, men that he'd fought with in the Boer War. He was a member of Parliament, but he'd served in the Imperial Yeomanry during the Boer War, and in an action had been recommended for the Victoria Cross for his bravery. He then moved to Sussex, purchased Hurstmonceux Castle, and used the people that he knew through being a member of Parliament and through the wider social circle that he moved in to recruit this battalion to offer it to the War Office. And his intention from the very beginning was, just like those northern Pals battalions, was to represent the county of Sussex through the sort of men that it drew in. So that first Southdowns Battalion that recruited 1,100 men in just over a day brought in the men who worked on the wider Sussex landscape, the farmhands, the sheep herders and the downsmen of Sussex, but also being a county that was by the sea, good old Sussex by the sea, men who worked in the fishing fleets in places like Hastings. But it then drew in the white-collar workers, people who worked in offices in places like Brighton and Eastbourne and Chichester. And very quickly, even in just that very first battalion, it quickly came to represent the county of Sussex, from the very humblest of farmer to the sons of wealthy landowners. Lowther acquired some land near the village of Couden, a place that he named Couden Camp, and here they established their first base. The men were brought in from the recruiting points across Sussex by train, all paid for by Lowther. He paid for the wages of these men, he paid for their billets, their equipment, the movement of them, he paid for everything. And he brought them in to Couden Camp, and initially they lived under canvas. I'll put a couple of pictures of what the early Couden Camp was like. It was pretty basic, bell tents on a slope, a lot of them flooded. It was quite difficult. The golden summer of 1914 increasingly moved into an autumn that was wet and cold, and men used to living in houses suddenly living in tents often found that quite difficult. But quickly it was realised that this one battalion wasn't enough, so the formation of a 12th and then a 13th Battalion of the Royal Sussex Regiment, a 2nd and 3rd Southdowns Battalion, quickly followed. And each one continued that representation of the county of Sussex. So in the 11th, the original one, A Company was made up of all Eastbourne men, C Company was Worthing, and D Company was Bognor and Chichester. And that one, in the mid-80s when I was living in Bognor, there was a lot of people in the town who had connections to those early Bognor men. One of them was Regimental Sergeant Major May. He was SD1. Now, all of the men recruited into these battalions were given regimental numbers. There were no army numbers at that time. And it being a new army battalion, the first man in was number 1. And the first man into the South Downs was Regimental Sergeant Major May. And to distinguish that this was the South Downs Battalion, they gave the men who joined these battalions in those early months the SD prefix, the South Downs prefix, to that number. So he was SD1. He was an old soldier who'd fought in many campaigns, including the Boer War, where I believe that's where he first met Claude Lowther. So he knew him from previous military service. His eldest son had been born in India, and he joined the battalion, and his youngest son, who was only a teenager, joined up as a boy soldier. So the whole family, the May family, were involved in this. And they gathered together the Bognor recruits in the High Street in Bognor, marched them off to the railway station where they joined the men from Chichester, and then they made their way across to Couden Camp to join them there. So that was the original battalion. The 12th, again looking at their recruits, A Company, again an Eastbourne company. So Eastbourne contributed a very, very large number of men to the South Downs battalions. B Company was Brighton, C Company Worthing, and D Company Hastings. So again, we can see how it went right across the county in a way that no other Kitchener's Army battalion of the Royal Sussex Regiment did. And when we say Worthing and Hastings and Brighton, that also includes all of the small villages that were scattered around those places where a handful of men from each location came to join these battalions. As the unit grew into 3 infantry battalions, the slopes and the fields of Couden Camp were not enough with just bell tents, and there was an overflow of men that ended up being billeted with the civilian population in Bexhill and Hastings. And there's some great photographs of these men standing on the doorsteps of some of these big houses where they'd been billeted. Now that worked pretty well, but soldiers in uniforms with boots stamping around your house are going to do damage, and this caused a bit of an issue. So Lowther used his own money again, and he purchased a whole series of wooden huts that he brought down and had constructed on the Couden camp site, which could house the entire Southdowns Battalions, all three of them, in these different huts, massive huts. It was said by some of the veterans that I spoke to, more about them shortly, that some of the huts could be capable of housing almost an entire infantry company, so a good couple of hundred men. And that gave them a semi-permanent sort of base there and a proper base for their training and development. The whole infrastructure of the camp grew as well. It was close to a railway station, so supplies and equipment could be brought in, and the men could go home on leave. They were given home leave while they were training at the camp. There was also a swimming pool constructed for the men. Lowther realised from his own military experience that sport was really important, so he paid for an Olympic-sized swimming pool to be constructed for the men to use, and he really favoured the idea of boxing, so there was a lot of boxing matches where the men could build up their physical strength and, to a degree, I guess, their aggressiveness as soldiers by doing this. And you see a lot of photographs from that period of men engaging in boxing matches, friendly ones with their mates, in and around these big huts that had been constructed. Now, in the 1980s, when I was researching these guys, it wasn't just in the paper archives and talking to people who had connections to them. I kind of went on a trail of the Southdowns to follow them, to see what remained of the world in which they'd been formed and existed and marched off to war. So one day in the 80s, I went down to Couden to see what was left of Couden camp. And I took the train and got off at Couden station, and it's almost like a halt. It's in the middle of nowhere, really, but it's quite a big station, and when you come off, there's quite big ramps. And this surprised me for a small station to have these sort of ramps. And although I don't think they were built at the time the Southdowns Battalions were at Couden, when they moved out, the Royal Artillery moved in. And I realised by standing on these ramps that they were wide enough to get field guns off of a train, down the ramps, onto the road and up to the camp, or vice versa when these men moved off to war. So it's probably a legacy of the First World War experience, if not the Southdowns themselves. So leaving the station, I went up to where the camp had been. There'd been some building, some new houses, and part of the land where the bell tents had been had disappeared. Some of the old houses that appear in some of the wartime photographs had gone as well, and the Olympic-sized swimming pool, sadly, had disappeared sometime in the 1960s or 70s. But the headquarters for the officers was based around a house, and I discovered that this house was in the Couden Golf Club. So I went in there, and I had a group photograph of the officers outside this building. As I turned into it, there was a distinctive shape of a chimney, which the men and the officers had been photographed in front of, and I could do an instant then and now. And somebody from the office of the golf club come out and politely asked what I was doing, and I showed them the photographs. They'd never seen these, and they were fascinated to learn the military history of this. So exploring that site, there was not a massive amount of it left, but it gave me an idea of just how big Couden camp was, because with well over 3,000 men there, they needed the space to house these men, train these men, and march them around. And marching was a big part of the training that they did. They were seen on the roads and in the villages and on the outskirts of Bexhill and Hastings, which was close by, on a regular basis. They very much became part of the Sussex landscape, really, at that time, and an obvious sign that Sussex had gone to war. And that probably, in the early months of the conflict, probably induced even more men to join. So there was a 14th Battalion Royal Sussex Regiment, which was never called the 4th Southdowns, but it was a sort of a feeder battalion to the others, and some of the later recruits ended up in that. And by the time they stopped using the SD prefix, it had gone up into the 5,000 mark. So something like 5,000 men, because the numbers were not duplicated, had joined these battalions between the very first formation in September 1914 and when that kind of recruitment ended in the late spring of 1915. As Christmas of 1914 approached, the three battalions were in these huts. It was going to be a cold winter, not the coldest winter of the war, but a different sort of winter for most of these men, living in a wooden structure rather than a brick house or wherever they'd come from. And what you see in the photographs is the change in uniform as well, because when the battalions had originally been formed, most men are photographed parading in their own clothes. There were no uniforms at all. The whole development and formation of Kitchener's army, the new army, had created this massive problem for the War Office. It had solved the enlistment problem. Huge numbers of men had stepped forward and joined up. But where do you put them? What kind of uniforms do you put them in? Where do you get those uniforms? Where do you get the weapons that they need, the personal equipment, the forage caps, the boots, everything? Now, Lowther was paying for this, but there was a national demand for this sort of equipment, and it meant that they couldn't supply everybody. So in those early months, the men were in their civilian clothes. And then something called Kitchener's Blues was developed, and this was a provisional uniform that many men in Kitchener's army, the new army, wore, a simplified version of the tunic, a forage cap instead of a peaked cap, and often, certainly in the Southdowns Battalions, they wore collar badges if no cap badges were available, because there is even a shortage of those. Now, although this was a military-looking uniform, it wasn't massively popular, not just amongst the Southdowns, but the wider aspect of the new army. Many felt that it looked like some sort of prison uniform, as if they were convicts, so they weren't entirely happy about wearing it. And gradually, certainly for the Southdowns Battalions, from the late summer into the early autumn, when that Kitchener's Blues uniform, you see them in a lot of photographs of that period, they begin to get the first khaki, service dress khaki coming in, and you begin to see the changeover in uniforms. And by the Christmas photographs of 1914, almost every man is now in khaki, with a proper uniform, a proper cap with a cap badge on it, a set of 1914 pattern leather equipment. Now, there was still not enough webbing to go around, the 1908 pattern webbing, so the War Office issued this 1914 pattern leather equipment, which was a leather belt with a snake buckle, 2 ammunition pouches, leather straps to hold it in place, a leather entrenching tool cover, a leather bayonet frog for the bayonet to go in with the entrenching tool handle, and a leather sort of like a holster almost for the water bottle to go in as well, and a canvas haversack with leather straps to fix it on to the cross braces. So it made them look like soldiers, but the 14 pattern leather gear again was not popular with soldiers because it didn't carry the weight of the equipment and the ammunition in the same way that the webbing gear did. That was much better, and it was quite uncomfortable to wear on long marches. But the Southdowns had it right up until they went to France. When they first went over the top at Richebourg, most of them were probably still equipped with the leather pattern gear, and they didn't replace it with the webbing until they moved probably down towards the Somme front later in 1916, and that was not untypical of many units of the new army with their war experience on the front line. In June of 1915, Claude Lowther, and by this stage the battalions were being called Lowther's Lambs. Their mascot was Peter the Lamb, who was a Southdowns sheep, and every time I walk the downs and see Southdowns sheep on them, I think of that and the connection with Lowther's Lambs and the Southdowns Battalions. But Lowther, being a member of Parliament, was called back to that kind of work and gave up his command of the Southdowns Battalions. There was also a belief, I think, that he was perhaps too old to take them overseas. There were now 3 lieutenant colonels, one each commanding the 3 battalions, and there was really no place for Lowther in that equation. So he relinquished his position, and on the 1st of July 1915, the War Office officially took over the battalions. Now, this created some changes because they officially, properly became part of the army at this point. Before that, there'd been a sort of ad hoc organisation within the army, a lot of it, as we mentioned, paid for by Lowther himself. And what happened was that, just like RSM May and his family, a lot of young boys and a lot of old men had joined the battalion, so both below and above the usual military age. And the War Office simply got rid of these soldiers. If they were obviously too young or obviously too old, they went. So RSM May is a good example of this. He was sent off to a reserve battalion, and he ended the war as an RSM in a training reserve battalion, training young soldiers to go overseas. He sadly died of illness right at the end of the conflict and was buried in his hometown of Bognor. His youngest son was then kicked out of the Southdowns, and by the end of the war he was conscripted into the artillery and served again. But he went on to always consider himself as a Southdowner and never attended any Royal Artillery Old Comrades meetings, but always went to the reunion of Lowther's Lambs, the Southdowns men. RSM May's eldest son was sadly killed at Richebourg on the 30th of June 1916. So the battalions changed at this point, and really they became more military in every respect. The training was ramped up a level. The men really found themselves part of the proper army, and they moved from Couden, from Sussex, to neighbouring Kent by train, and they went to Detling and took over the high ground around the Medway River, where they spent a lot of time digging trenches. And when you read the accounts of the men who were there at that time with diaries and letters, it was the summer of 1915, almost a year on from when they'd first joined. They're all in khaki, they've all got their gear, they've all got their rifles. But what they talk about is the camp being completely overwhelmed in a plague of earwigs, which made their life, particularly under canvas again, having come from wooden huts, and here at Detling they were back under canvas, it made their life very, very unpleasant indeed. Thankfully they were only there for a short while, then they moved in September 1915 to North Camp at Aldershot, where they joined the 39th Division, the 116th Brigade of the 39th Division, so became part of a bigger formation. And here again they probably felt like they were part of the real army. This was the home of the army, the heart of the army, Aldershot, and there they were training, mainly weaponry training, rifle training, before they moved off to another camp, which was at Whitley, just outside Guildford in Surrey. They arrived at Whitley in the autumn of 1915, in October, and went from the canvas at Detling back into wooden huts. This was a properly constructed camp, Whitley, a massive, massive camp that remained in use throughout the First World War, with men from many different nations being billeted here at different points. Canadians were here at one point during the First World War as well. So this was a permanent camp where the last phase of their training took place, and where they began to prepare for their eventual transfer to the Western Front and active service. They were photographed extensively at Whitley Camp. They got a photographer in from Aldershot who had specialised in military portraits and group photographs before the First World War, particularly for the Guards regiments that were based close by. And he came in and he photographed every single company of all three battalions. So A, B, C and D company of all three battalions was photographed as a whole, and then platoons could also choose to have their photographs taken. It wasn't down to section level, so it wasn't below that, but what it did mean is that a large number of men were photographed. Now, over the years I've managed to pick up quite a few of these, not an example of every company photograph, but quite a few of them, and I'll put one on the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk, so you can see what I'm talking about. Sadly, they didn't add the names to them, so when you get these, you've got no idea who these people are. You can pick out one or two people, commanding officers, the adjutant, Colonel Griswood, who commanded the 11th Battalion, and his brothers, Company Sergeant Major Nelson Victor Carter, who would go on to become the first and only recipient of the Victoria Cross to the Southdowns Battalions. So you can pick out some, but there's no names added on there. So that's quite a frustrating thing with just about any images of the Great War. But this was an important part of the final phase of their formation and training before they went overseas. And again in the 80s, following the world in which the Southdowns, Lowther's Lambs had once lived and functioned, I went to Whitley Camp to see what was left of it. It's forested now, and there's no trace of any of the huts. There's a few structures that appear to be part of the camp, but I've been given the nod by somebody that I knew who was a metal detectorist that it was a much frequented area of bottle collectors, because there were big rubbish tips from the Great War, and a lot of stuff came up in glass, and the bottle collectors used to go in there and dig up their bottles, which was, of course, quite acceptable and quite allowed and was absolutely fine. But what they didn't want was any military paraphernalia. And my friend has said, if you go there, you will find military artefacts just tossed around where the bottle collectors don't want them. And I found this a little bit difficult to believe until I actually went there, and literally within 10 minutes, just walking through the undergrowth, had picked up a couple of bags full of enamel gear, metal fixtures, tin mugs, and all sorts of other things that were clearly part of military kit issued to soldiers at this camp during the First World War. And I have a box load of these that I still have that I picked up there, which I'm going to pass on at some point to our old friend Taff Gillingham with the Great War Huts project, because this is artefacts that came from a Great War hut at Whitley during the First World War, and it seems that really should be the place where those artefacts reside in his excellent project that he's got going on there. And if you're not familiar with Great War Huts, go back into the podcast back catalogue and you'll find our chat with Taff about that and the links to the website with the project that they're doing. So by March of 1916, Lowther's Lambs, the other battalions in their brigades and division were all ready for active service. This is quite late on, considering that they've been formed in 1914. It's March 1916. They still haven't gone overseas. This is no reflection on their ability or inability. It was the nature of the size of Kitchener's army. It took a long time to train it, a long time to prepare it, and a long time to dispatch it overseas. So this final phase of these early war volunteers were sent over in those months after the Battle of Loos, when the men of Kitchener's army were used for the first time on the Western Front, and in the approach to the Battle of the Somme in 1916. And they crossed from Southampton to Le Havre, made their way up into northern France, and their war began. Bob Short, one of the veterans I interviewed, summed it up well. He said, "Colonel Griswold called the men on parade and told us we were going to France. Everyone cheered. This was it. We were finally at war." The men of the Southdowns Battalions crossed from Southampton to Le Havre in several ships on the night of the 5th-6th March 1916. It was a smooth crossing. They'd been given a mug of tea as they got on board. There was a bit of food, but there was the ever-present threat of German U-boats in the Channel, and they saw the destroyers and armed ships supporting them as they crossed to the French coast. For many, they looked back. It was not the chalk cliffs of the Sussex Downs that they were seeing, but the town of Southampton and the coastline of Hampshire. Nevertheless, this was the last they saw of dear old Blighty as they headed off to active service. On arrival at Le Havre, they went into a camp close by, were processed via the infantry-based depot, and then sent up to northern France. They were sent into the line near to the town of Esters, not far from Armentières, and this was a sector that had remained quiet since the early battles of the war and was considered one of these nursery sectors where you could safely send new units from England who had yet to see active service into a static part of the line where they could learn about the day-to-day activities of trench warfare. So they went into the line close to the village of Fleur Bay here, where this was a flat bit of northern France, where the trenches were a mixture of trenches and breastworks, positions built up above ground level, and they did their first tour of the line, in many cases alongside regular or territorial battalions who'd been there for quite some time, who instructed and taught them in what they had to do. Now, in those early months, with all battalions that served on the Western Front, mistakes were made which cost men's lives. Men looked over the top of the trench, the parapet, and German snipers killed them instantly. There were quite a few examples of this. Men lingered in groups in trenches, so when a random trench mortar shell came over, they were all killed or wounded. And if we look at the early casualties that are buried in some of the cemeteries in that area, and we look into the stories behind them, it's this sort of thing that we discover. It's a sad reality of a unit full of keenness and desire to serve overseas, but not realising the reality of it until they were there and experiencing it before their very eyes, and costing lives as part of that experience, sadly. They spent 3 months doing this kind of static trench warfare experience, learning about the day-to-day activities of being on the Western Front, serving both here at Fleur Bay and then down at Givenchy and Coinchi, where the brick stacks were located, where the trenches were very close together, and there were these massive brick piles that dominated the landscape, and they looked down onto each other's sets of trenches. Quite a lot of casualties there from rifle grenades and trench mortars. There was mining activity around Givenchy, and they saw at a place called the Duck Spill, a mine crater formed with the explosion of a mine, and realised that the war didn't just take place on the surface, but it was beneath the surface. And indeed, they supplied quite a few men in working parties to go down into the tunnel systems and take away sandbags of spoil to be scattered behind the front to disguise the sort of work that the tunnellers were doing. So all of that kind of activity connected with the day-to-day activities of a static front is what they experienced. The Battle of the Somme was looming close, but they were not going to be in the initial phase of that. Instead, they were part of one of the diversionary attacks, which was going to take place near the village of Richebourg in northern France. And the idea for this is something that the army did quite a few times in the early phase of the Great War, with the Battle of Loos, for example, where they attacked at the Bellewaerde Ridge in Ypres simultaneously, and also in the Indian Corps sector near Neuve-Chapelle, to try and confuse the Germans as to where the true intent of the attack was coming in. So they decided to try that with the Somme by launching a full-scale assault on the 30th of June 1916, the day before the Battle of the Somme, with a dual purpose to draw German attention into that sector, away from the Somme, and in this particular area around Richebourg, where there was a promontory in the German line called the Boar's Head, or that's what it was marked on our trench maps as, to straighten that out a little bit. And all 3 battalions were detailed to take part in that. Now, it was quite a last-minute thing, and the battalion commanders were given their instructions. The 11th, being the 1st Southdowns Battalion, was detailed to be the assault battalion in the attack, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Grieswood. He'd lost one of his brothers from illness just a month or so before, and his younger brother was a platoon commander in the battalion. When he was given the instructions for this attack, Bob Short, who was one of these veterans that I interviewed in the 80s, said that he told the brigadier that he was not prepared to sacrifice his battalion as cannon fodder. And with a battalion commander essentially refusing to make an attack, that had to be taken seriously. The 11th Battalion was given a subsidiary role, and Grieswood was dismissed from that command and sent home. Now, we won't go into the attack at Richebourg in any great detail because we covered that in a previous podcast, and probably we'll have one where we go back there when we can travel to these battlefields again and have a podcast where we follow in the footsteps of the Southdowns or that particular battlefield area. But what it meant for the Southdowns battalions is that the 12th and the 13th led the assault in the early hours of the 30th of June 1916 and suffered over 360 men killed and about 1,100 wounded or taken prisoner. So it saw the virtual destruction of those 2 battalions. And of the 360 odd men killed that day, it affected 77 towns and villages across Sussex. So Lowther's original intention to create units that represented Sussex, just in the way that other parts of the country recruited battalions in Accrington or Barnsley, where I live now, to represent those communities. It was great because the men knew each other, they had a similar background, they had a connection to the landscape where they came from. They would go across to serve side by side together, go into the trenches together, but in a big attack like this, they would get killed and wounded together, throwing these communities into mourning. And that's essentially what happened with these Southdowns battalions, and was why back in those early years of researching them, I kept coming across this date in cemeteries and memorials right across Sussex. So Albert Banfield, who was another veteran, and again I'll talk about the veterans towards the end of this, he referred to it once as the day Sussex died, because of the tremendous casualties that were suffered in these battalions. And that was a phrase that he kind of came up with and said that it was something that The men in the battalion often referred to it as that. And I wrote that in an article in 1986 on the 70th anniversary of the Richebourg attack that was published in the Chichester Observer. And ever since, it's become a kind of byword, a strapline for the sacrifice of the Southdowns, the Lowther's lambs at Richebourg on the 30th of June 1916. And it's great, particularly during the centenary, to see how that concept of the day Sussex died inspired so many people to research the Southdowns Battalions, the men who died that day, and how it affected their wider community. Worthing, for example, that recruited so many men into the Southdowns Battalions, now has its own little memorial that recalls the day Sussex died. And that's a great outcome of just a casual phrase that was mentioned in a chat with me by a Great War veteran almost 40 years ago, and how that has continued to resonate down through the years and will no doubt continue to do so. So, again, I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to talk to men like Albert Banfield to elicit that sort of concept of what the war meant to them from those sort of interviews. So with 2 battalions badly mauled by Richebourg, and the 11th, which had been pulled back and just sent 1 company into the attack, which suffered a lot of casualties, they had to be rebuilt, and they did some periods of static warfare again, holding the line in northern France until August of 1916, where, having been made up with reinforcements from reserve battalions of the Royal Sussex Regiment, some men came over from the 5th Battalion, the Cinque Ports Battalion, and also they got men from other regiments like the Sherwood Foresters and the Ox and Bucks, who got sent to the base and then sent up as reinforcements, took their Ox and Bucks or their Sherwood Foresters badges off, and suddenly they were part of the Royal Sussex Regiment. Made up with those kind of men, they were then sent down to the Somme and began to take over the front line around Beaumont Hamel in the trenches that are now part of the Newfoundland Park. That was one of the earliest areas that they served on the Somme front when they first arrived, and suffered their first casualties there by just holding the line again. And then on the 3rd of September 1916, they took part in an attack close to the village of Hamel. The intention of this attack was to push the Germans back on the northern part of the Ancre battlefield. To the south was the village of Thiepval, still very much in German possession, with the continued fighting around the Schwaben redoubt. And on the 3rd of September 1916, the wider 39th Division was attacking north of the River Ancre, near to the village of Hamel, and then south towards the village of Saint-Pierre-d'Ivion, and the Southdowns were involved in crossing a bit of ground where the Ancre British Cemetery is today. We did a podcast on this area, and I mentioned in greater detail the story of what happened to some of the Southdowns that day. But this was in terms of this story of Sussex to the Somme, this really is the key turning point for these 3 battalions, the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Southdowns, Lowther's Lambs, because, again, they suffered tremendous casualties here in that attack on the 3rd of September 1916, and really it marked the end of the originals. There was always, right until the end of the war, because the 11th Battalion went on to serve in Russia in 1919, for example, there was always some original men left, but the composition of the battalions changed forever after the attack at Hamel. The men that replaced the losses here came from all over Britain, and these were Sussex battalions really in name only, and that reflected, of course, the wider army. And they remained on the Somme right up until November 1916. They took part in an attack in the last Battle of the Ancre on the 13th of November, and by that stage quite a number of men serving in these battalions were some of the first conscripts from May and June of 1916 who'd been trained up and then sent overseas. So it just reflected the whole changing nature of the whole British Army during this phase of the Great War. So after the Somme, the battalions moved up to Ypres, and they served there for over a year on the Bosinger sector. They took part in the opening stage of the Third Battle of Ypres, with the attack on the village of St Julian and the Steenbeek River, and then later fought in the battles of the Menin Road Ridge and along the Menin Road, close to both Hooge and Gheluvelt. In 1918, they were involved first in the German offensive on the Somme in March, the Kaiserschlacht, where they were pushed back across the Somme battlefields and suffered again tremendous casualties, including a large number of men taken prisoner there. The battalion was made up again with reinforcements that came across from people from all over Britain, and then moved up to Flanders. And in April 1918, during the Battle of the Lys, they were destroyed once more. And at that point, the battalions ceased to exist as a coherent and efficient fighting force, and were essentially downgraded and did not take part in any more fighting on the Western Front. The 12th and 13th, 2nd and 3rd Southdowns Battalions effectively ceased to exist. The 11th remained in Britain, and as I mentioned previously, they were posted off to Russia in late 1918, where they took part in the Russian Civil War, fighting Bolshevik forces there. And quite a number of Southdowns who, from the very beginning of the battalions, were there. A couple of them were killed, some of them were decorated with gallantry for their bravery in Russia, and that was the end of their war. So this is not a detailed account of their battalion history, and I called it Sussex to the Somme for that very reason, that this was a period from their formation, from the place that they came from, through to their destruction at Richebourg, and then finally on the Somme, that really their war continued beyond that, but really their war for the originals came to an end with that attack near Hamel in September of 1916, because the battalions were no longer representative of Sussex in the way that they had been in the very beginning. And most of the veterans that I interviewed in the 80s were men who did not serve much beyond that period, because they'd been wounded either at Richebourg and transferred on, or commissioned, or certainly in the fighting on the Somme in September of 1916. And it was tracking down those veterans in the 80s that was one of the most incredible parts of this. It was great to follow them in Britain, and then I went out to Richebourg in those days when things like linesmen, digital trench maps, none of that was available. There were photocopied maps from the National Archives of Public Records Office, as it was in those days, and using those and modern Blue Series French IGN maps, was able to work out where the Boar's Head had been, and then go there and visit that bit of ground. That was fascinating, but the greater fascination, the really incredible bit of it, was talking to the men who had served in those battalions. Living in Sussex and being a student in Sussex, it wasn't difficult to track some of these guys down. And once I found one, he often knew another, and I had friends who knew I was interested in this. So I probably spoke to a couple of dozen men who had served in these Southdowns battalions. Not all of them original, some who'd been arrived as replacements but from later on, but they gave me this incredible insight into what it was like. And one of them that I've mentioned in this podcast, and indeed in previous podcasts quite a few times, was Albert Banfield. And he lived down in Hove, where he'd been born. He'd gone to war with his brother Marcus. They'd served from the very beginning in the 13th Battalion, the Royal Sussex Regiment. Both been at Richebourg. They were signallers, gone over the top with the battalion, survived Richebourg, survived the Somme, survived Passchendaele, survived the Kaiserschlacht, and then in the April 1918 offensive they were split up, and Marcus was killed and Albert came home. They both kept detailed diaries during the war, which their parents typed up, and then those were eventually bequeathed to the regimental archive in the West Sussex Records Office in Chichester. But when I went to speak to Albert Banfield in the late 80s, it was this time where he'd written about it, of course, but he'd never spoken about it in that kind of depth. And I like to think it was quite cathartic for him, because he was able to talk about a lot of things, and he was a very intelligent man with a good command of language, and he was able to express things in certain ways that some veterans often struggled to do. They struggled to verbalise how they felt about these things, but he could, and that made him, to me, one of the most precious veterans that I ever interviewed, because of the way he spoke about the war. So that's something that I'll always remember. And in his room, he had a little frame on the wall with 3 photographs, one of himself in uniform, one of Marcus in uniform, and one of a young woman. And the young woman transpired to be his wife, his love of his life, who, when I interviewed him, he'd only lost a few years before. and spoke about her so fondly and often with tears in his eyes. An incredible man, incredible experience talking to these guys. And another veteran I went to see in Brighton, it was about the time that some old people had been attacked in their homes for their pension books and things like this. And when I rung up, he said, "Oh, my son wants to speak to you." So I spoke to his son, who was rightly and understandably a little bit suspicious of this person wanting to talk to his dad. But when I explained what it was about and what it was for, he was really quite interested. So I went round to see him, and the son was there when I arrived, again, quite understandably. But the old chap said, "No, go on, you get in the room at the back there. I don't want you in here when I'm talking to this man." So the son had to go in the back room, and the door was shut. And I sat there with this guy, and he spoke for nearly 3 hours, almost non-stop, about his war from the formation. He'd served in the 13th Battalion, and then Cooden, Detling, Aldershot, Whitley, Richebourg, everything like that. And he'd been a great boxer, this guy, and he spoke a lot about army boxing. And then after about 3 hours, he said, "Oh, I suppose we'd better have a cup of tea now." And he sort of banged on the wall, and the son opened the door, and he said, "Make us a cup of tea, will you?" So I said, "I'll go and give him a hand." So I went out to the kitchen and helped his son. And his son said, I was listening at the door with a glass. He said, "I've never heard him talk about those things. I've never heard some of those stories. It's quite incredible." And it shows, not just with these Sussex veterans, but the wider veterans that I spoke to, just how much of this they kept in and how much of it they kept from their immediate family. And when a stranger like me came along and asked the right questions, I hope in the right way, it opened that up for them, and they were able to talk about it. And I really hope that it helped these guys come to terms with some of the experiences that they'd had, even if that was only in a tiny, small way. But for me, of course, it gave me this great legacy of having spoken to these men and heard their stories. And it's something that I try to express in this podcast, because their war experiences never left them. They never went away. They tried to do it. They tried to suppress them, but they couldn't. They'd come to the surface in tiny little things. For Albert Banfield, rain pinging on the roof of his extension would remind him of the rain pinging on his steel helmet in the front line in a trench on the Somme or at Ypres or wherever. And forever in their mind was that experience of war. Not just the hard and the terrible things, but the funny things, the comradeship, everything that they'd seen, everything that they'd experienced, everything that remained with them of their time along the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.